In the peaceful town of Willow Creek, life moved slowly and predictably. The streets were lined with white fences. Children played in the park after school, and on Sundays, nearly everyone gathered at the old brick church at the edge of town. The man who led that church was Pastor Daniel Whitmore, a figure of quiet strength and unwavering faith. For over 15 years, he had been the spiritual backbone of the community. People trusted him, looked up to him, and many credited his guidance for holding their families together during hard times. Pastor Daniel's wife, Grace, was equally adored. She carried herself with grace and humility, always helping with church events, bringing meals to the sick, and leading the women's prayer group. Though she rarely spoke about her personal struggles, everyone knew she had one: her inability to have children. After years of trying, she and Daniel had accepted their fate. Grace would often say, "We are enough for each other. God has His reasons." People admired their strength and devotion. Then, one Sunday morning, everything changed. It was a bright spring day, and the church was filled with the usual warmth and chatter. After the sermon, Pastor Daniel stood at the altar, ready to deliver the closing prayer, when Grace quietly stepped up beside him. She smiled nervously and placed her hand on her stomach. At first, people were confused. Then she said the words that stunned everyone: "I'm pregnant." There was silence for a moment, followed by gasps and cheers. The congregation erupted. In applause, many wept. After all those years of waiting, after all that heartbreak, the Lord had finally blessed them. It was a miracle, a true one. At their age, with their history, it didn't seem possible. But Grace looked healthy, glowing, and genuinely happy. Pastor Daniel smiled and held her hand tightly. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind the celebration, Daniel's heart was pounding in a different rhythm. The moment Grace made the announcement, something inside him shattered, because he knew something that no one else did. Many years ago, long before he ever became a pastor, Daniel had undergone a painful medical procedure after a serious infection. The result had left him permanently sterile. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever had to face, but Grace had stood by him. She had known. They had mourned the dream of children together and moved on. And now she was pregnant. He kept smiling, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. But his mind was spinning. How could this be? Had Grace been mistaken? Was it really possible that somehow, against all odds, something had changed inside him? He tried to reason with himself, telling himself not to panic, to wait and see. Maybe there was a medical explanation. Maybe the doctors had been wrong all those years ago, but deep down, Daniel knew better. The certainty he felt was cold and clear. This wasn't a miracle. This wasn't divine intervention. This was betrayal. That night, while Grace slept peacefully beside him, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling. He could hear the soft sound of her breathing, the faint rustle of wind outside the window. He didn't move. His mind was drowning in questions he couldn't answer. Who was it? When did it happen? And why? They had never spoken of infidelity. He had never even considered the possibility that Grace would do something like this. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her, but the math didn't lie. The science didn't lie. Somewhere, somehow, something had happened. And now, a new life was growing, a life that should have been impossible. What began as a joyful announcement in front of an entire church was, for Daniel, the beginning of something much darker. He didn't know it yet, but the secrets buried beneath Grace's smile were deeper than he could imagine. And the truth would lead him down a path of obsession, deception, and quiet, calculated revenge. The days following the announcement felt surreal for Pastor Daniel. Everywhere he went, people congratulated him. Church members dropped off baby gifts, homemade casseroles, and knitted blankets. Women from the congregation asked Grace for pregnancy tips and gave her parenting advice. She smiled through it all. glowing with joy, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. Daniel smiled too, but each time someone said, "You're going to be such a great father," it felt like a blade twisting in his chest. Inside their home, nothing seemed out of place. Grace moved around the house with ease, humming softly, folding baby clothes, painting the nursery walls with soft yellow patterns. She kept a pregnancy journal beside her bed and talked excitedly about names. But for Daniel, every moment felt like a performance, and he was the only one who knew the play was fake. He couldn't bring himself to confront her, not yet. There was too much he didn't understand. He needed answers. Quietly, carefully, he began watching. Late at night, when Grace was asleep, Daniel would sit in the dim glow of his study, staring at her computer. He searched through browser history, photos and emails. Nothing stood out. No messages. No signs of a secret. Everything appeared clean, almost too clean. That's when a thought occurred to him. People rarely use emails these days for secret things. They use their phones. Grace had always been private with her phone. She kept it close, password protected. But one evening, while she was taking a bath, she left it on the kitchen counter. Daniel opened it, heart pounding. Messages, photos, anything. But again, nothing suspicious. Just conversations with friends, church updates, reminders for doctor appointments. He felt like he was losing his mind. Was he wrong? Could there be another explanation? But then, tucked inside the lining of her purse, he found something she had hidden, a folded paper, torn along the edges. It was a motel receipt. A small, two-star place about 30 minutes outside Willow Creek. The date caught his eye immediately, 2 months before the pregnancy announcement. It wasn't a place they had ever stayed together. And the name written on the billing information made his stomach turn. Jacob Rains. Jacob was the young, charismatic youth minister recently hired by the church. In his late 20s, unmarried and full of energy, he had quickly become popular with the congregation. Teens loved him, and even the older members admired his enthusiasm. Grace had often praised Jacob's leadership, saying how the church was blessed to have him. Daniel sat at his desk staring at the receipt for hours. The questions in his mind now had direction. He wasn't dealing with some anonymous stranger. He was looking at a man he had mentored, a man who worked under him, a man who stood in the same pulpit and called him brother. The thought made his skin crawl. Still, Daniel didn't act. Not yet. He wanted proof, not just suspicion. He began watching Jacob at church, the way he moved, who he spoke to, how he looked at Grace. Everything seemed normal. Jacob smiled, joked, gave his usual sermons. But Daniel noticed small things now. A glance held a second too long. A nervous shift when Grace entered the room. Once, during a staff meeting, Jacob dropped his pen and seemed genuinely startled when Daniel picked it up for him. That week, Daniel bought a small surveillance camera and installed it in the home office where Grace often took her phone calls. He placed it behind a stack of books, pointing directly at the desk. Every night he reviewed the footage, hoping to catch something, a name, a slip of the tongue, anything. But days passed with nothing but silence. Daniel began to feel like he was chasing ghosts. His mind replayed every interaction between Grace and Jacob, every sermon, every church picnic, every shared smile. He stopped sleeping. He stopped praying. Something had shifted in him. He wasn't just a betrayed husband anymore. He had become something else entirely, a man waiting in the dark, watching, listening, and planning. Whatever had happened between Grace and Jacob, he was going to find out. And when he did, he wouldn't just expose the truth. He would make sure they both understood the weight of their sins. Pastor Daniel's obsession grew stronger with each passing day. What had started as quiet suspicion had now turned into a mission. He moved through the motions of daily life, sermons, meetings, church events, with the same calm, collected appearance he was known for. But beneath his smile, he was boiling. Grace continued to act like everything was perfect. Her belly grew, her voice stayed cheerful, and she spoke about the baby's future as if nothing at all was wrong. Daniel played along, nodding at the parajind. Right times, pretending to be excited, but inside he was keeping track, watching every move. Planning his next step. The surveillance footage showed nothing useful. No phone calls, no conversations, no hints that Grace was in contact with Jacob. She looked completely innocent. But Daniel knew better. He held onto the motel receipt like it was a key to a locked door. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough. He needed real proof. The kind of proof no one could argue with. The kind of truth that couldn't be erased with lies. So he came up with a plan. At a weekend church barbecue, Daniel acted as if everything was normal. He laughed with members of the congregation, helped flip burgers, and handed out lemonade. Jacob was there, moving through the crowd like usual, high-fiving the teens, chatting with the elderly, and offering prayers to those who asked. But Daniel never let him out of sight. He waited patiently, and when Jacob finally finished his drink and set his cup down, Daniel was there. He picked it up, slipped it into a bag, and tucked it into his jacket. He drove home early and stored the cup carefully. That night, while Grace was asleep, Daniel collected something else, one of her prenatal vitamins from the bottle on her nightstand. He didn't need many samples, just enough for what he had in mind. The next morning, he made a call to a private DNA lab in the city, several hours away. He explained that he wanted paternity testing done quietly, no questions asked. The man on the other end of the line didn't care why. He just gave instructions and a mailing address. Daniel followed everything carefully. He sealed the vitamin capsule in the cup, labeled them separately, and sent them off by overnight courier. The wait felt endless. Days turned into weeks. Daniel went about his duties like a machine, preaching sermons he barely remembered, counseling churchgoers with a blank smile, sitting beside Grace in the evenings while she read baby books aloud. But inside he was counting hours, imagining all the possibilities. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he had misunderstood everything. Maybe the child was his. Maybe there had been a miracle. When the envelope finally arrived, Daniel sat alone in his office, holding it for several minutes before opening it. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper with clear, clinical language. The DNA extracted from the vitamin capsule was a match 99.8% to the DNA from Jacob's drinking cup. The child was not Daniel's. The truth hit like a quiet explosion. It didn't knock him down. It didn't make him cry. Instead, it filled him with a calm so chilling that he barely blinked. The mystery was gone. The doubt had been erased. The betrayal was complete. He stared at the report for a long time, reading the lines over and over until they felt burned into his brain. Then, carefully, he folded the paper and slid it into a drawer at the bottom of his desk. He didn't confront Grace. He didn't confront Jacob. Instead, he sat in silence, letting the weight of the truth settle inside him. It didn't shake his faith. It didn't even surprise him. It simply changed him. He had spent years believing in forgiveness, in second chances, in the power of prayer. But now, all that had faded into something colder. He didn't want apologies. He didn't want tears. He wanted resolution. And in his mind, he already knew exactly how it would unfold. 2 weeks before Grace's due date, Willow Creek woke to a buzz of confusion. Jacob Raines was missing. He hadn't shown up for youth service, hadn't answered his phone, and no one had seen him since Friday night. At first, people assumed he'd gone on a short trip, maybe needed time to clear his mind. But as Sunday came and went with no word, concern turned into fear. Flyers were printed. Volunteers walked through parks and neighborhoods calling his name. The church held a vigil. Pastor Daniel led the prayer, his voice calm, steady, even comforting. He asked the congregation to remain hopeful and lean on God during uncertain times. No one could tell, by looking at him, that he already knew exactly where Jacob was not at home. Grace looked pale. Her energy had shifted. She no longer hummed around the house or folded tiny onesies with care. She moved slowly, distractedly. Her appetite was fading. She often stared out the window for long stretches, rubbing her belly in silence. When asked what was wrong, she only said she was tired. Daniel, on the other hand, appeared lighter than he had in weeks. He no longer combed. Through surveillance footage at night, he slept soundly. He had stopped watching. Because everything was done, days before Jacob disappeared. Daniel had approached him privately under the guise of a church matter. No one noticed them leave. No one saw where they went. What happened in those hours remained unspoken, but Jacob was never seen again. There was no struggle. No signs of violence. No evidence. Daniel knew exactly where to place someone if he wanted them to vanish without trace. Deep in the forest, beyond the trails and paths, stood an old hunting shed that had long been forgotten. Years ago, it was used by Daniel's uncle for weekend trips. Over time, it had rotted from neglect. But the foundation remained solid. Underneath, the dirt was soft, perfect for burying secrets. He returned to the shed alone the night Grace gave birth. The baby came early, a healthy boy with soft skin and bright eyes. The town flooded the couple with gifts and tears of joy. The church gathered for celebrations. Daniel held the child with ease, kissed his wife on the forehead, and posed for photos like any proud father would. Grace tried to smile, but something in her had changed. That night, while she rested, Daniel drove back to the woods with a shovel in the trunk. The air was cold. Rain had started to fall. He parked near the shed, careful not to leave tire tracks, and entered the crumbling structure. With only a flashlight, the floorboards creaked as he stepped inside. He crouched down, removed a loose plank, and looked into the shallow grave. The body hadn't moved. The soil had held firm. He checked everything twice before replacing the boards, sweeping away any signs of disturbance. As he stood in the doorway, watching the rain fall around him, he felt an unexpected calm. The storm, both outside and inside him, had passed. Back in Willow Creek, the search for Jacob slowed. The police found no leads. They questioned church members, checked traffic cameras, combed through his home. Nothing. He had simply vanished. Some suspected suicide. Others whispered about secret struggles. But no one ever guessed the truth. No one ever looked at Pastor Daniel, the grieving father and community leader, and thought him capable of such silence. Grace said little about Jacob's disappearance. Whether she suspected something or chose not to ask, Daniel couldn't tell. Her silence served him well. With the baby in their arms and the town's sympathy wrapped around them, the Whitmores appeared stronger than ever. But beneath their perfect image lay a buried truth, rotting quietly beneath the surface of the woods. Nearly a year passed in Willow Creek, and the memory of Jacob Rains faded like an old photograph. The town had moved on. The police filed the case as a missing person with no foul play suspected. His things were boxed up and returned to his family. His office at the church was cleaned out and reassigned. Only the occasional candle lit in the chapel hinted at the loss. Life returned to normal, at least on the surface. Inside the Whitmore home, the atmosphere was different. The baby had brought joy in chaos, as all infants do, but Grace no longer looked like the woman she once was. Her face seemed thinner, her eyes often distant. She moved through her days with a quiet detachment, taking care of her child, tending to household tasks, but speaking less and less. Daniel continued his routines with perfect control, preaching on Sundays, holding counseling sessions, hosting community dinners, all while raising the child everyone believed was his own. But the silence between Daniel and Grace grew louder. With each passing month, Then on a rainy afternoon, while cleaning the garage, Grace stumbled across something she wasn't meant to find. Tucked inside an old toolbox beneath dusty rags was a sealed envelope. She opened it without thinking. Inside was the DNA report, crisp, clear, and devastating. She stared at it for minutes, her hands trembling. She read the lines again and again, her breath catching in her throat. It confirmed everything she had tried to bury in her mind. Daniel had known. He had known all along. The baby wasn't his. And yet he had said nothing. He hadn't accused her. He hadn't demanded answers. He had simply smiled and carried on day after day. Grace's stomach turned. Questions filled her mind. Why hadn't he left her? Why hadn't he confronted Jacob? Where was Jacob? She rushed to her room, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the report. Her thoughts spiraled into fear. She hadn't heard from Jacob since the early weeks of her pregnancy. She had assumed he had run away, panicked by the consequences. But now she wasn't so sure. Her mind returned to Daniel's calmness, his sudden acceptance, his unshaken presence in the weeks following Jacob's disappearance. It didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every sound outside the window sent her heart racing. She began watching Daniel closely, trying to see what she had missed before, the way he looked at the baby, the calm in his voice, the steadiness in his hands. It was too perfect. Days later, heavy rain swept through Willow Creek. The river rose, flooding parts of the surrounding woods. A group of hikers passing through a remote trail noticed the old hunting shed had collapsed partially from water damage. Out of curiosity, they stepped inside, where the stench of decay greeted them. They called the authorities. The investigation took only days. The police discovered a shallow grave under the floorboards, the body badly decomposed but still identifiable. Dental records confirmed it. Jacob Rains. The news shattered the town. The headline read like a nightmare. The beloved youth minister found buried in the woods. Murder suspected. No signs of robbery. No signs of struggle. Just silence. Grace came forward first. Tearfully, she handed over the DNA report and confessed everything she knew, the affair, the receipt, the sudden shift in Daniel's behavior. She admitted she had suspected the worst but kept it buried, too afraid to face what it might mean. Daniel was arrested quietly, without resistance. He offered no explanation, no apology. In court, he refused to speak. He simply sat still as the prosecution laid out the evidence, the motive, the cold, calculated revenge. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.